Hey everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Last time we started the second PowerPoint by discussing the transatlantic slave trade, sort of defining what that was, sort of giving some background on African slavery and the differences between African slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Briefly talking about the journey, what that looked like, how people, stayed in factories before they were placed on the ship. We also discussed Sir John Hawkins, who was the first British man to really profit from the slave trade. So today we are going to continue talking about the transatlantic slave trade by discussing some more details about it. We will discuss a black man who actually published his own autobiography describing his journey on the transatlantic slave trade when he was a kid. We will also talk about two events on slave ships. One was a massacre of slaves, and one was a rebellion by the slaves. So some interesting topics today. So to start off, our first topic is slave trade kicks off, essentially what it means, right, what it says. So before the Europeans even thought to get involved in the African slave markets, the Portuguese would encounter them in order to ransom for Portuguese sailors. So sometimes slaves were often traded, whether for not only just for goods, but also for hostage or prisoner situations as well. The first to use African slaves in the New World were the Spaniards, who wanted them for their conquest expeditions and as laborers in Cuba and Hispaniola, starting in 1501. Cuba eventually became one of the largest sugar growers in the Caribbean. Also, some slaves were used with the conquistadors, right? The conquistadors would use slaves and Native Americans on their expeditions as scouts, spies, translators, all that stuff. The Portuguese began to ship African slaves after they established their first sugar plantations in northern Brazil. In fact, around 84% of the Africans that were shipped to the New World were intended for sugar production. Now, we'll talk about in our next lecture how Africans were often threatened, right? African slaves were threatened by their masters in North America to be sent to sugar plantations in the West Indies, because notoriously sugar plantations were some of the most dangerous conditions you could work in, because not only do you have to cut the sugar cane down with machetes and stuff like that, which is very dangerous, you also have to press the sugar out of the canes, which led to a lot of accidents as well. Plus the West Indies are notoriously very hot. And of course, the slaves weren't given a lot of water throughout the day, so a lot of deaths as well. So those type of conditions were often used as a threat for slaves who weren't cooperating. As for England, they became involved because of their rise in naval power and successful colonization of Africa. The majority of England's slave ships came from Bristol, Liverpool, and Manchester, which built their wealth off of the slave trade during the 18th and 19th centuries. The British Navy is notoriously one of the best navies in the world, right? And for a while, they dominated the oceans, essentially. The first Africans to arrive in the Americas came on July 1526. Okay. As part of a Spanish conquering expedition, these slaves successfully rebelled and joined the nearby Native American tribe. So even though I mentioned before Native Americans, some did have slaves, often African slaves would marry or join Native American tribes. So there was that camaraderie as well. When the first African slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, they were classified as indentured servants and freed after serving for 7 years. However, by 1662, slave children had to take on the status of their mothers, who by that time were subject to chattel slavery. As I mentioned, you're sort of owned and sold as property, which ensured that most African slaves were not freed. So first of all, with the Jamestown slaves, right, a lot of people can trace their ancestors back to pre-colonial Jamestown, right? Jamestown was the first successful settlement in what is now the United States. England had a previous settlement called Roanoke, which notoriously had all of their settlers disappear like mysteriously, right? They just vanished. So technically that was the first British settlement, but Jamestown was the first successful one. Of course, everybody knows it because of Pocahontas. So if you check out video A, this is an exploration of Jamestown, which has kind of been sort of rebuilt for tourism, but they more recently found some of the remains of these slaves from Jamestown. So you can take a look at that. Now, the 1662 point is important because taking on the status of your mother, right, is crucial because even if, right, there weren't a lot of black men or slaves having sex with white women, or if they were trying not to get pregnant because white women were ostracized for doing that, right? We will discuss that later on in a different topic, right? So if you take on the status of your mother, most of the time, if you were born black, you're born from a black mother, right? Whether you were mixed race or not. So during this time, so that sort of, told pretty much all the slaves, like, you and your family members until the foreseeable future are going to be slaves, right? Which sucks. And that's also, unfairly making it about skin color as well, right? Because their slaves were only black. So you're just basically saying black people are the only ones who are going to be slaves, right? Not the indentured servants from Europe or anybody else, right? And also, it's sort of the underlying implication is that if a black woman is sexually assaulted by a white man and it results in a pregnancy, then that child is automatically going to be a slave, okay, despite the fact that their father was not. So that was a huge turning point in slavery for this country. Before the slave trade, Africa and Europe were relatively close when it came to the use of new technologies. However, because the population in Europe and the Americas grew far more quickly, and with profits from the slave trade, they were able to invest more in technical advancements, which would culminate into the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. I mentioned this before, right? That a lot of the money from the slave trade funded some of the greatest inventions we ever had, right? Disgraced comedian Louis C.K., who I don't support anymore, but for various reasons. But he once had a joke that was kind of true, which basically said, like, that the greatest accomplishments in human history have been done by basically throwing people at them, right? So, like, the pyramids of Egypt were built by slaves, right? The American economy was built by slavery, right? Things like that. Right? If you don't care, then your progress is more infinite. So, and then here is a picture of a slave just arriving, right, being kind of inspected. We'll talk about that inspection process next time. So, Karl Marx, who famously created the concept of communism, he wrote in one of his books, Das Kapital, that the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production, meaning that, capitalism is our concept of a free market, right, where you have competition. Some people can raise themselves up from poverty and get more rich potentially. Oh, excuse me. And he sort of says that, like, this class system where you have slavery that's free, right, when you have the slaves coming in and doing most of the labor and making their masters rich without them having to do a lot of work, that created capitalism. So it's kind of interesting. Some historians argue that racism was the consequence of slavery, as the influx of slaves and particular attention to one demographic of people gave birth to the idea of preserving a dominant race and assigning a whole group of people as inferior. So that's what I'm trying to say, right? It's like if you say, oh, your mother, if she was a slave, you're a slave, right? That they weren't trying to grab any other, people of different skin color or ethnicity or whatever. Like, that says a lot about racism and the origins of it. Our next topic is a man named Aluda Equiano. Okay, you're probably like, how do you spell that? Well, we'll see that in the next slide. So this man we're going to talk about specifically because, again, he wrote an autobiography of his life, which was very widely published at the time, very popular, and it was some people's first look at a first-hand account of what the transatlantic slave trade was like. Okay, so if you take a look at video B, this is a man sort of portraying Aluda Equiano and telling his story. Now, this video is about an hour long. You do not have to watch the whole video, right? If you just skip around and get some good bits of it, like, that's fine with me. Like, I'm just saying, you don't have to sit there for an hour. Okay. So Aluda Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vasa, he's had a couple different names, was born in 1745 in Igbo land, Nigeria. We kind of mentioned the Igbo people before and sort of the battles that they had. Equiano claimed that he and his sister were kidnapped by slave traders at the age of 11, while they were looking after their home while their parents were away working. After being separated, Equiano was transported to Barbados along with 244 other slaves. He was then sent to Virginia, where he was bought by Lieutenant Michael Pascal, who was in the Royal British Navy, in 1754. He was renamed Gustavus Vasa and taken to England, where the money accompanied his master during the 7 Years' War against France. So his master, right, was a seaman, right? He traveled a lot. He made good money. He brought Equiano with him, so he got to get naval experience. So the reason why, too, a lot of people take a look at Aluda Equiano's autobiography is that it shows a different side of slavery, right? Most people think like, oh, all the slaves came here and they were on plantations or they worked in the master's house. Not necessarily, right? There were different ways of being a slave, so this is a good example of that. Equiano was trained in seamanship and would haul gunpowder to the gun decks during battles. He also learned how to read and write from his master's sister-in-law and was baptized into Christianity in 1759. Equiano was sold to a different master in the Caribbean before being bought by Robert King, who was a Quaker merchant from Philadelphia. Now, the Quakers are notoriously very forward-thinking. They believed in like the women's rights movement. They eventually started to advocate for the abolition of slavery, things like that. So Quakers were pretty liberal thinking compared to other religious denominations. He worked in King's shipping routes and stores until 1765, and at the age of 20, he was allowed to buy his freedom for 40 British pounds. He stuck with King, his former master, now his mentor, who made him more fluent in English and taught him about trade. Equiano traded fruits, glass tumblers, and other goods between Georgia and the Caribbean, although he was almost kidnapped back into slavery. By 1768, he continued to primarily work in the sea trade, working mostly out of England. In 1773, he joined the British Royal Navy ship Racehorse as part of their expedition to the Arctic in order to find a northern route to India. So he even got to go like really far up north. Like, this guy's been all around. It's pretty cool. In 1775, Equiano was got with Dr. Charles Irving, who was in charge of the Arctic trip, in order to select and manage slaves for sugarcane plantations along the Mosquito Coast, which was Nicaragua and Honduras. So Equiano did oversee slaves, right, on a plantation, which is interesting, right? During the 1780s, he settled in London where he joined the abolitionist movement. We'll talk about abolitionism throughout this class. It's basically the belief that slavery should be ended, right? There's a whole movement for it. Specifically, he worked with the Society for Effecting the Abolition of Slave Trade, which was founded in 1787, which wanted to appeal to Parliament directly. So his fellow abolitionists supported him in his endeavor to write his memoirs or his autobiography. But there was one event that really troubled Equiano, and that will be our next topic. Okay, so the Zong massacre was something that Equiano really put forth to these abolitionist societies, saying like, this is wrong. This is exactly what I was talking about with regards to how evil the Atlantic slave trade is. Okay, and as you can see in this picture, these slaves are being thrown overboard. So let's talk about why that was the case. The Zong was a slave ship that was commissioned by the Dutch company Middelburg Commercie Compagnie, based in Middelburg, Netherlands. On August 18, 1781, the ship set sail to Jamaica from Accra, Ghana, with 442 slaves, which was twice the ship's capacity, so they really packed the slaves in there. On the 18th or 19th of November, the ship had the opportunity to replenish its water supplies in Tobago, but failed to do so. Tobago's right next to Trinidad, by the way. With the captain gravely ill and the first mate previously stripped of his duties over an argument, there was no clear authority on this journey. So basically, you had no captain, you had no leadership, right? Things are about to get worse. On the 27th or 28th of November, the ship spotted the coast of Jamaica, but mistook it as the island of Hispaniola. So they continued farther west despite the fact that overcrowding, malnutrition, meaning that people weren't eating enough, accidents, and disease had already killed some of the sailors and about 62 Africans. If the slaves would have died upon arrival or died of natural causes out at sea, then the sailors would not have had their journey insured. So sometimes, it's pretty sick to think about, like sick in a bad way, but the ship owners would have these slaves insured, right? That's why they kept logs and stuff. So basically, if something happened on the journey that was out of the captain and the crew's control, then they would collect money from that dead slave so that they still could make a profit. It's really gross, but that's what they did. There was, however, a policy called general average, which rewarded captains for getting rid of part of their cargo in order to save the rest. As such, each slave that was lost on that ship would equate to 30 British pounds in an insurance settlement. On November 29th, the crew began to consider throwing some of the slaves overboard, ultimately throwing 54 women and children overboard that same day. On December 1st, 42 male slaves were thrown overboard, with 36 more following the next few days. Also, 10 jumped themselves, right? They didn't want to be there anymore. In total, around 142 slaves died during this voyage, with one managing to climb back into the ship. So basically, to summarize, right, the slave traders, right, the sailors, right, missed Jamaica. They were running out of water, food, all that stuff. So they decided, hey, instead of losing all this money for these slaves who will probably die by the time we actually reach Jamaica, because we don't know where the hell we're going, let's just throw them overboard. We'll claim that they died on the journey due to a water shortage and all that, and we will collect the insurance, right? Very evil, Very evil. It's bad. Okay. Here's what some of these slaves look like in their barracks. This always reminds me of the bunks that were in concentration camps during the Holocaust. Right? It sort of looked like that. So, although the sailors claimed that they did not have enough water to sustain these slaves, it was later proven that they had 1,900 liters of water by the time that they finally reached Jamaica on December 22nd. And on the day that they killed 42 male slaves, it had rained considerably. Okay, so that debunked their insurance claim, right? When the insurers refused to compensate the ship owners for their losses, the ship owners sued. The ship's logbook had mysteriously disappeared once the crew reached Jamaica, so they got rid of it so that they didn't show the evidence, right? The initial trial, which took place on March 6, 1783 in London, the judge having already ruled in a different case that slavery was not supported by British common law, therefore disallowing the potential of keeping slaves in England. So there's a famous case before this, right, where a judge basically said that slavery has no place in England and there will be no slaves in England, right? Huge case, huge. Ironically, this judge also had a half-black granddaughter who we will see a clip of in just a little bit, right? Her name was Belle. The jury ruled in favor of the ship's owners, arguing that slaves were property, right? And therefore were insured in this case. After Equiano told Sharp about the murders, right, Sharp was a famous abolitionist, a second trial was held on May 21st to May 22nd, 1783, with Sharp in attendance. Again, former crew members argued that it was necessary to throw the slaves overboard in order to preserve the rest. The insurers argued that because the crew failed to recognize Jamaica in the first place, that they threw the slaves overboard so that the new captain could still have a good voyage. And they also argued that slaves are people. This is one of the first times that you heard in a court sort of this defense of slaves. The insurers won when the evidence of the rainfall came. So in the first trial, when the slavers won, they didn't know about the rainfall. And then in the second trial, someone proved that, no, it was raining, you guys are lying, right? Although the insurers got the money from their claims back, no sailors were prosecuted for the murders of the slaves. The massacre became an important rallying cry for the abolitionist movement, who used it in order to emphasize the horrors of the slave trade. So it sort of became a calling card for people, right? They're like, if you're disgusted by slavery, look at this and make an important change. So if you take a look at video C, this is a clip from a movie about Belle, who I just mentioned, right, whose grandfather ruled that slavery doesn't belong in Britain. So Belle is talking to a British nobleman who she sort of has like a romantic thing kind of going on with, and asking him about the massacre and sort of providing her own opinion as a woman of color. So take a look. The movie is really good. It sort of shows, it shows, because Belle was a real person, it shows sort of a black woman who's actually treated a little bit better, right? But she's still sort of harassed based on the color of her skin. This is what the slave ship looked like on deck. So they bring you out on deck, remember to like dance, get your circulation. They also did this on the Zong massacre, ready to throw the slaves overboard. All right, let's continue with Oluda Equiano. So, excuse me, these allergies are no joke, guys. Oluda Equiano's memoir, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oluda Equiano, released in 1789, went through 9 editions during his lifetime. The book was one of the earliest books by an African author to become popular in England. By 1792, it became a bestseller, with copies also circulating in Russia, Holland, Germany, and the United States. It was also the first published slave narrative, despite the fact that, unlike other slaves, Equiano never had to do field work, worked at sea, got involved in the trading business, and could read and write, as I mentioned, right? It's way different than our perception and majority of the lives that slaves expected to have during the time. If you take a look at video D, this is the entire audiobook of Olaudah Equiano's autobiography. Again, you don't have to listen to the whole thing. It's 8 hours long, but if you just skip around and hear snippets, that'd be good. Some readers felt that ashamed, right? They felt shame, and they felt ashamed in general when learning of his being kidnapped from Africa, fueling a growth in the anti-slavery movement. So the slave trade was something that a lot of people decided to ignore, whether it was easier or, it's sort of like when you try to, well, it's not the same, but like that feeling you get when you see like a commercial about abused animals, right? You don't want to necessarily look at it, even though you should, right? Sort of like what a lot of people did with slavery. But the book really opened their eyes to it. Now they couldn't ignore it, and they actually got to hear what the Africans were experiencing, right? Very troubling for a lot of people, but it was really good because it increased abolitionism. In the book, Equiano claims that he came from Asaka, which is Nigeria, describing the laws and customs of the Eboa people. He also describes the communities that he passed through on the way to the slave ship. Equiano describes in great detail his journey on the Middle Passage, as well as the brutality of slavery in the West Indies, Georgia and Virginia. Although, remember, he was the one who helped run those sugar plantations, so, ironic. He informs his readers of the limited rights that free blacks possessed, as well as emphasizing the dangers of them being kidnapped and re-enslaved. He claims that his Christian faith was tested in 1774 when his friend, a cook named John Annis, was kidnapped from the ship that they were both working on. It was illegal for slaves to be taken from England without their permission by that point. So basically, Equiano brought attention to his friend and worked to help spread his story, because his friend Annis worked on a plantation until the day he died, so it's very unfortunate. His memoir did so well that he was able to pay back his benefactors and promoted the book in England, Scotland, and Ireland. So oftentimes you had to have benefactors who were rich people who would pay for your book to be written, like mass-produced and published and circulated. In 1783, he worked with the Black Poor of London organization, which worked to help black slaves who were freed by the British during the Revolutionary War, in addition to regularly freed slaves and those from the Caribbean. He also was part of an expedition to resettle escaped slaves and the London's Black Poor to Freetown, Sierra Leone, which is one of the first African settlements for returning former slaves. So he's also part of the Sons of Africa, which was a group of free Africans who fought for abolitionism. After he settled in London, he married a white woman named Susanna Cullen on April 7th, 1792. Some say he viewed his marriage as a union between England and Africa, and they had 2 daughters. So he died the year after his wife died in 1797. He spent the last years of his life working with charities like the Sierra Leone Company, which supported West Africans, and the London Missionary Society, which provided education overseas. He was valued for portraying the dignity of African life in the white society of this time. So that was Olaudah Equiano. And I have to pause this video sometimes because, my voice dies. So if the quality of my voice changes, it's because of that. But I'm trying my best. And here's another, this is a color portrait of Ludo Equiano in his later years. So here's a quote from his book. This is the first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast of the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror, which I am yet at a loss to describe, nor the then feelings of my mind. When I was carried on board, I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I was got into the world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. So this is essentially his account of his impression as a young boy when he was brought onto a slave ship. Very terrifying. So we've talked thus far about the horrors of the slave trade and a massacre that occurred. Now let's end today by talking about our last topic, which has to do with a successful slave rebellion. Now, these did not occur very often on slave ships. Maybe you had a little tiny rebellion where a couple slaves got freed, kill a couple sailors before they either jumped off the ship or the sailors killed them. But a massive rebellion where the slaves won their freedom was rare indeed. Okay. And the only case we have, one of the only cases we have were successful, was the Amistad Rebellion. Okay. If you take a look at video E, this is a trailer for the movie Amistad. It's very hard for me to watch because they show the middle passage and it's very disturbing. But let's talk about this ship, what happened, and how the slaves got their freedom. So, on June 27th, 1839, decades after slavery was abolished in the United States, so we're kind of skipping far ahead in time, just because it still has to do with the transatlantic slave trade, and I want to keep it very thematic. But do keep in mind this was after America was already a country. The Spanish vessel La Amistad left Havana, Cuba, for the province of Puerto Principe, which was also in Cuba. Around 55 African slaves were on board, with only 4 days' worth of rations. On July 2nd, an African named Cinque used a file that was hidden by one of the slave women to free himself and the rest of the slaves. The Mende African slaves from Sierra Leone killed the cook, who told them that they would be eaten by the slavers. Then they killed Captain Ferrer, who took down 2 Africans with him. This picture is a depiction of that battle. 2 of the sailors managed to escape in a lifeboat, while 2 of the Spaniards were spared in order to navigate the ship. They also spared a Creole man, Antonio, so that he could translate for them when communicating with the Spaniards. Okay, so essentially they killed everybody in the ship except 2 Spanish men who could run the ship for them, and then a Creole man, Creole meaning that this man was probably Spanish, mixed with Spanish and black, and maybe Native American as well, could translate for them. Rather than following the Africans' plan to sail back to Africa, the crew sailed to the east coast of the United States because the Africans had no idea where they were going, where they dropped anchor a mile off of Long Island, New York, on August 26th. When some of the Africans went ashore for more supplies, they were spotted by the USS Washington, who took custody of La Amistad. Let's go to that. So here's another depiction of the ship's battle. Lieutenant Thomas R. Getney, the captain of the ship, tried to claim both the ship and the Africans under international salvage laws after taking the ship to Connecticut. So he claimed, like, we found this ship, we found these Africans that are cargo, right, therefore property, so they belong to us. Because slavery was still legal there, Getney had hoped to make a profit off of the captured Africans. He then transferred them over to the United States District Court of the District of Connecticut. So basically, this is like a federal court in Connecticut, right? Just to sort of simplify this long name. Getney, the Spanish government, the captured Spaniards, and the Africans themselves all argued for the right to the lives of the African slaves. So the Africans had to fight the Spanish, again, the Spanish, this lieutenant, the Spaniards that they spared the lives of. They had to argue all of them for their freedom. He then transferred them, the British demanded that the United States release the Africans because the Spaniards had violated a treaty with them that forbade the slave trade south of the equator. Okay, so there's another whammy thrown into this, right? This is a very complex case because it's like the British said that they had a treaty with the Spanish that said that they couldn't trade slaves anymore south of the equator, which that area that they were going to, right, was south of the equator. So now the British are in it. Henry Stephen Fox, the British ambassador, said that now the unfortunate Africans whose case is the subject of present representation have been thrown by accidental circumstances into the hands of the authority of the United States. Okay. The central argument that the courts had to consider was whether or not the Africans on the Amistad were enslaved, right? Because they were on a journey to be enslaved. If they had been made nationals during their time in Cuba, meaning that they were made into Spanish citizens or sort of maybe even refugees, then they would be under the jurisdiction of the Spaniards. But if they had been slaves or intended to be sold as slaves, then it was a violation of that treaty with England, right? Mind you, the Africans were intended in one way or another to be punished for killing most of the Amistad's crew. Okay, so there was that on the table as well. So you're probably like a little bit lost, but this is a lot going on, right? The case made its way to the United States Supreme Court on February 23, 1841, where Attorney General Henry D. Gilpin presented papers that states that the Africans were Spanish property. And take a look at that. This is a depiction, I think, of Cinque, the guy who freed the rest of the Africans on the Amistad. Because of these papers, he argued, the Amistad slaves had to be returned to the Spanish government. John Quincy Adams, who by that point, right, before he had been the 5th president of the United States, he's the son of our 2nd president, John Adams. By this point, he went back to being a lawyer, argued on behalf of the Africans, right, as a former representative of Massachusetts as well. The defense argued that because the Africans had been freed through their trials in the circuit courts, so that the Spanish government was trying to manipulate the court into returning their fugitives. Okay, so this is kind of complicated. Circuit courts are basically these government courts that you had to get through in order to get to the Supreme Court, right? You can't just go up to the Supreme Court and say, I want you to look at my case, right? You have to go through your local courts, your state courts, and then the circuit courts that are in D.C. So it's a very, very long process. You have to go through many judges. So John Quincy Adams argued that because the Africans had gone through these lower courts and the lower courts said that they're technically free, he's like, well, they're free, so you can't just give them back to the Spanish, right? On March 9th, the Supreme Court ruled that the Africans were unlawfully kidnapped and forcibly and wrongfully carried on board a certain vessel. Thus, the documents that the Attorney General had submitted to the court were evidence of fraud on part of the Spanish government. Lieutenant Gainey and the crew of the USS Washington were awarded some of the stuff from the Amistad as a reward for bringing the ship in, so they did get to profit a little bit. Additionally, the court determined that when the ship was brought into Long Island, it belonged at that point to the Africans, and thus the president did not have to return them back to Africa. The 36 African men and 3 African girls who survived the journey were taken in by members of the abolitionist movement, who set them up temporarily in friendly homes along the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad wasn't just for sheltering escaping slaves, but also the members of the Amistad were there as well. And of course, we'll talk about the Underground Railroad later. In 1842, the 39 Africans and some Christian missionaries sailed to Sierra Leone. The Spanish government was never paid for the reported losses. Members of a committee that helped the Amistad former slaves get back to Africa would go on to form the American Missionary Association, which would sponsor the forming of several historically black colleges after the Civil War, including Howard University, which is my alma mater. So, a lot of connections here, right? You got a former president arguing on their behalf. You got a committee that would start historically black colleges, which we'll talk about later on. And the Amistad former slaves got to go back to Africa, right? We don't know what happened to them, or we're not super clear on what happened to them after they returned to Africa, but something like this, as I mentioned before, was rare. Like, you didn't have this happening a lot. But it instilled fear in the other sailors and slave traders. So conditions did get harsher in a lot of ways after something like this, because after hearing about this, they're like, ugh. But again, remember, the U.S. outlawed the slave trade in 1808. So there wasn't a lot of new slaves legally coming into the United States. So that's what made the case interesting as well at the time. So here we have the courtroom, right? The courtrooms are kind of informal, right? You didn't have benches, you just had chairs, sitting pretty close to the judge, people jumping up and yelling and shit. Right? And this is what the Amistad probably looked like. Again, they crammed 442 slaves onto that thing. Crazy. Wait, no, they had 50-something. I'm thinking of the Zong massacre. My bad. So that's it for today. Next time, we are going to finish up this PowerPoint by talking about what happened to the slaves when they actually got here, before they were sent to the plantations, and sort of the dynamics between master and slave. And then we're going to start our third PowerPoint by discussing some of the slaves, or some of the states, and what their versions of slavery were. Because, the United States, each of our states have different systems that we have even today. Back then, each state had their own way of doing slavery, and some had more slaves than others. So that's what we're going to start discussing next week as well.